In this episode, Dazzle and Mama Jane talk about when do you know when you should start doing something and when you should stop doing something, and what's the difference between the feeling of intuition and the feeling of insecurity.
It felt terrible to end our work on Mindset Runners. It felt like, oh my God, we've done all of this, and we're just going to stop it. But actually, up to that point, it was feeling terrible already because it was a grind and it wasn't the same passion. And that was because maybe we hadn't quite orientated ourselves with processes that had made it easier for us. And then we were trying to think of these processes like, well, if we do 4 videos in advance, then we'll have the space to think. And like, can you feel that energy? It comes across. It was like, it was a mad, frantic rush constantly. And then it felt terrible to even talk about it, to go, well, because both of us were thinking it. Both of us were already like, we already want to step away from this project, but we don't want to let the other person down. But just having the inspiration to have that conversation, or take the inspired action to have that conversation, actually took the weight off both of us massively. And it's not the end of the world. Like, you can always go back to stuff. You can always find this, you can always find that. But the fact of the matter was, we just didn't have the space or the time for it at that point. And it's really, it's interesting looking at it now, but you don't see that perspective until you've taken that action. You can't look forward. Of course, you can only guess or make educated presumptions on what's going to happen, but you've just got to take the action to see what actually happens. And ultimately, it was the feeling that guided us, because if it felt terrible, so I stopped doing it. It's that easy, isn't it, really? And I know that's a very specific topic, but I found that with other things. I'll probably think of things during this webinar, but I know that there are other times where go with the feeling of it and do the action, regardless to what you think the consequences might be. That's what I took from that.
Yeah. And on a sort of slightly different, worked out differently, but it's exactly the same thing, is that I started wisdom webinars in 2016, I think. And I didn't know what I was doing. And I'd been thinking about it for a while. And it actually all came about at a conference that I was at. And then somebody said, have you thought about doing mentoring with people and I was like, oh no, that's not really what I do. I work in prison. And they said, well, you know, you really inspire people, so you should do webinars or something. I said, well, I have been thinking about doing this thing. And so that's how the original, which was Wisdom Entrepreneurs, started. And every time I sat in front of that computer to do a webinar, I felt absolutely terrible, like a fake. What am I doing here? What about if I can't think of anything to say? What about if nobody turns up, etc.? And sometimes maybe only 2 people turned up. But that wasn't the same feeling of that, I think this is done, or I think we should pause right now. That feeling was more of a insecurity, because by the time I started the webinar and started talking to people, I loved it, you know, and I'd come off on a high, and I always used to feel like I'd just swanked off the stage, you know, at the end of it. And I used to always think that I should have a celebration after everyone. I enjoyed it so much, and, you know, be treated like royalty. So I knew that was insecurity. But there were times in that journey, and what's that, 7 years? There's at least 6 years of wisdom webinars now. There are times along this journey where I have thought, are we done? Is Wisdom Entrepreneurs done? And every time I've asked that question, it's been from an open space of, Because if we're done, and that's okay. And if we're not, I'll know the answer. And every single time something's occurred. So the very first time I asked that question, I thought maybe this is the last one. And someone came onto that webinar that evening whose son, I think, had been in prison. And they were so relieved to have that conversation. So I think there was 2 people turned up that night. And so that was my answer. If this helps one person, that's enough. And so I carried on. And then there were other changes along the way, like some of the boys got out of prison and then they came on, and then people wanted to hear their stories. And then there was another iteration, and so on and so forth. So every single time I've genuinely asked the question, are we done now? And every single time I know whether we're not. So far, we've not been. During lockdown, we made them weekly to support people and to have a place where people, the family could meet and we could have conversations together. And that was a lot of webinars in a short period of time. So I think for around about 18 months. And then it became obvious, right, that's enough now. It doesn't need to be weekly anymore. Now it can move to monthly again. And I asked the question, should it be quarterly? But each time I feel as though I know what the next step is, and I'm open to whatever that answer might be. And not a lot of thinking, not a lot of, how much time does it take me and all of that. None of that comes into it. The minute that comes into it, there's a red flag. The minute that it starts to be, well, this takes up all this time and it becomes a grind, as you just said, then that's the red flag of saying, oh, okay, hang on a minute, let's take a step back. So inspired action can be starting something and it can be stopping something.